Now, how does Hayek's business cycle theory go? Now, just like with Keynes, this is super simplified, but it comes down to three interlinked ideas: moral hazard, malinvestment, and systemic risk. And there's two other big ideas that now these two are also pretty mainstream, right? Monetarism, Weitzist. Interest rates in an economy reflect real feelings towards waiting. We call this time preference. How do you feel about waiting? Would you rather like give up more in the future to get more today, or vice versa? And how do you feel about risk? Does risk scare you? Are you willing to give up more to have a guaranteed outcome, or do you like to gamble? But interest rates are equilibrium outcomes of the supply and demand for loanable funds, and the equilibrium is efficient. Different people have different feelings on these issues, but everybody's sending their price signals in their decision to loan or borrow or not loan or not borrow. And so the interest rate you get is the best representation of how society as a whole feels about something. Now, people are generally risk averse. So, all else being equal, they're going to take safe investments first. If you have two different choices of what to invest in, and they both have the same expected return, and they'll both pay off in the same amount of time, right? These are like identical opportunities. It's just that with one of them, it's more likely to fail. Well, you're going to pick the one that's safer. And so, an economy that's left to its own devices is going to naturally fill in the safe choices first. And then, as you exhaust the safe investment opportunities, people start to flip to the riskier one. So, even when there are safe opportunities around, people might still go for some risky ones, but there has to be a high rate of return to compensate for it. And these high risk, high reward opportunities aren't that common. So as the economy expands, it's mostly going to prioritize safety. And this means that it develops kind of like a house that is built on a bed of rock. You get like the biblical illusion there, like a wise man who builds on rock. Or you might analogize it to, say, a house built of like Lego or a log cabin. All of the foundations are good. All of the pieces fit together snugly and support each other. And when one business fails, it doesn't take everything with it. Some of you watching this might be civil engineers or architects, so you could definitely get this idea. If you build a building and just taking away one support causes the whole building to collapse, you built a crappy building. You always have redundancy built into things. And in an economy where everyone is having to bear their own costs, where people are acting cautious, you get a lot of redundancy. You get businesses that, even if they go down in isolation, and other businesses still stand so that the whole structure of society doesn't crumble. So what happens when we do expansionary policy, like Keynes wants? Now, don't get me wrong, Hayek doesn't say that you never have recessions without Keynesianism. He just doesn't buy into the whole animal spirits and let's spend more money thing. Hayek would say, oh, it's all real shocks, right? If you know, if the economy starts to decline, there is a reason it declined. The long run aggregate supply must have moved. Well, what happens when we do expansionary policy? Well, the expansion of money is going to make borrowing cheaper. And that's the whole point. The whole way we expand the money supply is by getting more people to borrow. But because the money is cheaper, that also means that failing isn't as costly for the investor. They're still going to be out something, but they're not out by as much because the interest payment isn't as large. And so they're going to be willing to take riskier choices. At the margin, the risky option that you were kind of like, I don't know if it's worth, taking that gamble. What if it doesn't pay off? I still have to pay the money back. Well, at the margin, when you make credit cheaper, that decision flips. You might not be chomping at the bit to invest in it, but you'd say, okay, yeah, I'm not out as much now. And so people start to become a little more reckless. You might say that the cheap money is like a subsidy on risk taking. That when the Federal Reserve or any other central bank starts pumping money into the economy, starts giving bankers more money so they can throw loans around for free, they're subsidizing recklessness. And so malinvestment starts to happen. It happens on a much larger scale. Well, in the house that was built cautiously, in the house that was built on rock, the house that was built of strong pillars with many supports, with strong, good timbers as its materials, or the house that was built of Lego, where each piece snaps into the next, a few pieces can be bad, and yet you don't get chains of failure. But when the foundations are weak, when you built on a house of sand, like the foolish man, when you built of bad material, like a Chinese tofu drag, a skyscraper where you tear open the wall and you find styrofoam instead of drywall, when you build a house of cards, well, then it's a lot more dangerous. If one piece breaks, other pieces are depending on that piece to hold it up, and they tumble down too. Normally, individual failures don't matter, but this is where systemic risk comes in. Systemic risk, a situation where so many individual risks have been taken on, things which individually would be manageable, but when they're taken as a collective, there's greater risk because there's the possibility of catastrophic, spectacular, domino-like cascading failures. And why would this happen? Well, keep in mind, companies own stock in each other. Companies loan money to each other. They have contracts with each other. And even if every company existed in isolation, you still have spending multipliers. If that company fails, if it lays off its workers, if it stops buying material, well, all of the people that it would have paid can't spend that money now. And so it wipes out more than just itself. I kind of imagine it like an explosive going off. It takes off more than just itself. It takes off everything around it. I know my analogy is getting really convoluted now, but imagine like your house, but you have grenades hidden all through the walls. Well, if there's too much risk in the system, you get that domino effect. A bank went down, meaning that this other company that was invested in the bank goes down, which lays off its workers, which means there's not enough business to keep this other company alive, and on and on and on it goes. The house of cards crumbles. The tofu dreg crumbles. And Hayek says, your expansionary policy is what made the economy fragile. If people had to bear the full costs of their borrowing, that would mean they would have to bear the full costs of their own failures. And so they would take their investments a little more seriously. You've given them cheap money. They spent that cheap money with a cheap mindset. They behaved recklessly, and that caused this. Every time you do this quantitative easing, every time you sell these or buy these T-bills, you're setting up the next recession. And moreover, remember how I said the central bank is the lender of last resort? Well, most of the time, if a bank goes under, and it does happen, most of the time when they go under, federal deposit insurance is enough to take care of it. They introduced federal deposit insurance after the Great Depression because, we saw what happened with Black Monday. And if the federal deposit insurance isn't enough, well, then the Federal Reserve steps in. But if everything is melting down, even the Fed can't save it at that point. And what do people do? Well, they resort to the almighty power of Congress and the mint. If we can't use banker magic to fix this, then we're going to have to resort to, $1,000 checks for everyone. We're going to have to resort to massive trillion-dollar bills to pump the economy back up. Money printer go brrr. And one reason why they'll do this is that some businesses are too big to fail. This has a double meaning. It both means that they're so big that nobody ever expects them to fail. You wouldn't expect to wake up one day and hear that Walmart went out of business. You wouldn't expect to hear that Windows, Microsoft went out of business. There are businesses that everyone is just completely confident they will never fall. But the other side of it is these are businesses that are so large, we can't allow them to fall. If that business fails, it will take out so much of the rest of the economy that it will throw us into that chain reaction. So the state is kind of held hostage. These people caught things up. These people messed around, behaved recklessly, caused a collapse. But if we let them go out of business, it's going to end up hurting a heck of a lot more people than themselves. We have to do something. And then this leads to the third point, moral hazard. Moral hazard refers to a concept that if you protect someone from the negative consequences of their actions, they will never stop. And consequences can take in a lot of things, right? It doesn't strictly have to be monetary. In day-to-day life, social pressure, is one of the main things that people use to control our own crappy behavior. I like to use an example of the frat boy crashing his Lamborghini. And daddy buys him another Lamborghini. Is he going to crash the second one? Yeah, probably. Why not? if you don't believe that you're ever going to be punished, whether in a very literal sense, like with the force of law, or punished by suffering of your own making, if you don't believe you're ever going to be punished, why would you ever stop doing what you're doing? Well, when the government comes in and bails out the companies, that's the message it sends to them. You made a bunch of bad investments. Well, some of those investments, you made a bunch of good investments too. You made risky investments. Let's put it that way. Some of them paid off wonderfully. Some of them backfired horribly, except it didn't backfire horribly for you because the government came in and paid off your bill. If they didn't literally pay off your bill, they gave contracts for work or they gave amnesty for, the dangers you inflicted on others. Look at some of the news that's been coming out about the COVID vaccines, where they finally started to admit that, oh, yes, these rush job vaccines actually do cause myocarditis. Imagine. Well, they gave them full, they gave them amnesty in advance, said, oh, we're not going to allow lawsuits over that. I think I've whined about this before, but if you haven't, look up thalidomide. Look up thalidomide and the Tuskegee experiment. The bailout is even worse than the expansionary policy. I mean, it is the expansionary policy. You get two effects here. You get the immediate effect of, oh, whenever you use expansionary policy to cut short the recession, it causes this malinvestment that eventually is going to pop off and cause another recession. But the moral hazard also makes it even more intense because as long as they can anticipate that they're going to get a bailout, they're going to be even more reckless. Once. Now, there's always a room for risk because very often riskier opportunities also have higher rates of return. This is why people play the stock market. But that does assume, starting to storm outside, that does assume that the Mayday, Mayday, 1, 2, 3.